Hi again. Today we're going to be talking about binary form. Before we've talked about sentences and periods, that type of form, type of small form. So we're going to be expanding our knowledge to a slightly larger form, even though these are considered to be small forms, binary form. And this will allow us also, since we just discussed modulation, modulation, as you're going to find out, is an important part of the way of articulating different forms, and definitely true for binary form. So first off, some definitions. Binary forms are structured in two parts, as you might imagine. Each is usually set off by a repeat sign, so it makes it actually, just from a visual standpoint, extremely easy to know that you're dealing with a binary form. Now, where do you find these? In the Baroque era, you usually find it in suites, so pieces with titles like Jig, Allemande, Sarabande, things like that. Now, and then in the classical area, you're usually going to find it in the minuet and trio movement. The pieces that are usually in triple time, they usually have a couple of binary form sections within them. So the minuet itself will be binary, and the trio will also be binary. We'll talk about that a little later when we talk about ternary forms. All right, so it's a very simple concept. But now let's get into some of the details of this, like what to expect. These actually you really can come into a binary form with a lot of expectations, because many of them follow the same overall framework. I think, though, there are some pretty big differences between the Baroque era ones and the classical era ones. The classical era binary forms are much more predictable, I'd say, in what's going to happen. All right, so part one, this will be the music that's kind of like leading up to your very first repeat sign. So what's going to happen here? Usually you're going to find two phrases. Many times the two phrases will create a period structure, the antecedent and consequent idea. And anything in this first part, we'll label it with the letter A, so small a, by the way. So we'll call these phrases A1 and A2, like I did right here. So I'm showing phrases by these little curved marks. So now a part one may be sectional or continuous. This is one of those little terminology issues to show some differences that you might encounter. I'm trying to find some way not to get that shadow. So maybe sectional or, there you go, maybe sectional or continuous. Sectional means that the first part will end with a PAC in the main key, so there will be no modulation. In other words, this is what we call a tonally closed section. No modulation, and it ends with a PAC. So this would be shown on this example down here by this one right here. 1 to 1. By the way, the Roman numerals here refer to key areas. 1 to 1, PAC. That would be what we would call a tonally closed or sectional part one. Now, the other possibility would be a continuous, or what the book calls a continuous part one. A couple ways this could happen. One is that the section could end with a half cadence in the original key. All right, so it's going to be tonally open. More commonly, though, it's going to be a modulation to a new key. So that's usually what you're going to see for a continuous one, is that you're going to modulate to a new key. You know, you might have a pivot chord like we talked about last time. And the typical modulations for part one are, if you're in a major key, 1 to 5, and if you're in a minor key, 1 to 3. So, you know, this is going to be the groundwork for what we later call sonata form. This is kind of like a small version of this. And you'll find these options right here. The other two right here, sorry, that I bracketed, those would be your continuous rounded binaries. If you're in a major 1 key, you go to 5. If you're in a minor 1 key, you go to 3. And anyway, as far as the cadences go, I mean, it is extremely common to get this half cadence PAC structure, because a lot of times these are going to be periods. So that is kind of predictable. This is sort of where you find the most periods would be in these binary form pieces. All right, let's now talk about part two. So, you know, this is all very predictable. Part two, a little bit less predictable. Now, first off, part 2 will often have 3 or more phrases, but at least 2 phrases will occur in part 2. And it tends to be broken into 2 kind of spots or larger sections that kind of organize these phrases. The first one would be this digression part of this. Oftentimes it's just one phrase. We call this a digression, and I give the label B for this, kind of like a small b. This would be a melodically and harmonically unstable phrase that usually leads to a half cadence in the main key. All right, so this is kind of like the prototype for a development section later on. It's going to be unstable, but the one thing that's often predictable is the ending. It usually ends with a half cadence in the main key. So right here, B ending with a half cadence. I use the label 5 chord there because I want to put that into my diagram. I always want to label the cadences. And by putting 5 chord, it makes it clear that I wasn't talking about the key of 5, but it's actually the chord. Anyway, it's kind of a way to lead us back to the main key. After you have the digression, you're going to return to the tonic key. And so after the digression, you're going to have some tonal stability return. But there's something else you need to look at here. Is the binary form rounded or simple? It all depends on what happens at this moment. If it's a rounded binary, which is by far the most common one in the classical era, if it's a rounded binary, then the music from part 1 will return. So the A1 will return. It has to be the beginning, by the way. Of course, there can be little variations. And this is what we call a recapitulation. So a rounded binary means a recapitulation. I return to the music from part 1. Now, what music gets recapitulated? Well, that kind of depends on the situation. You may get the entire part 1, meaning A1 and A2. You may get the beginning of part 1, A1. You may get the end of part 1, just A2. Or you may get a mixture of materials from part 1. You can get a little bit of mixture of A1 and A2. And I use a little slash there to show that. So this shows you some possibilities for rounded binaries. Notice at the point of recap, I have it all in the tonic key. And then here are your different possibilities. The main one I showed you was when you get both A1 and A2 back. But then above that, I wrote some other options. You might just get A1. You might get a mixture of A1 and A2. Or you might get A2, only A2 back. That's what we sometimes call a balanced binary if you get just A2 back. But I think it kind of stands to reason. If you get A2 back, that's also probably, since this is usually a period structure, it's still the same material. And that's the opening idea is still going to be the same. So you get a similar effect. All right, now the other option, if it's not rounded binary, and again, rounded binary is the norm for classical era things. Baroque era, you might also get this simple binary. Here, at the return of the tonic key, there is going to be no recapitulation of materials from part 1. So you might get a phrase we call C, you might get a phrase we call D, and so on. In other words, we don't return to A. Even though we're back in the tonic key, we're not returning to the materials. It gives an overall more fluid kind of experience. Now this is what I showed right here. This is another possibility for it. This is the simple binary possibility. I still showed the digression leading to a half cadence, but when I get back to the tonic key, I don't have the A material. So I just put C right there. All right, so those are the basics, but each piece is going to be unique. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and do some analysis. On the next 3 pages, you're going to have 3 different binary form pieces. And what I want you to do, besides label the type of binary you get, is it sectional, is it continuous, is it rounded or simple? So you would use terms like sectional, simple binary, or something like that. But besides that, I want you to basically give me a diagram. And use the format that I'm showing you here in the handout. Kind of make them look like this. Put the key areas underneath. Put the thematic labels. Only thing I want you to add that I didn't add in the diagrams here because we were just doing it in the abstract is I want you to add the measure numbers at the moments of the cadences. All right, that gives you an idea about how long each of the sections are. So like right here, if that first half cadence happened at measure 16, put a 16 above that. And I like to circle those numbers. All right, let's work through these one at a time. All right, let's start with the Haydn one. And this is a minuet section. Let's just look at the minuet part of this. We could also analyze the trio for extra practice, but for the video, let's just take a look at the minuet section. And I want you to do a full diagram of this with all the information I just talked about. All right, let me go ahead and play this for you. All right, part one. Play the second part now just to save time. Second part. Sorry. Go ahead and pause the video and create a diagram. Then I'll show you what I have. All right, here's my diagram of the Haydn piece. This is a continuous rounded binary. Now, the continuous has to do with part one. Notice that part one, I just put a question mark by that first cadence. It's kind of weak, may not even be a cadence. The reason this is continuous is because we end on a half cadence. So I put half cadence in 5 chord to show that. So again, it would only be sectional if we didn't modulate and we ended with the 1 chord. So this is continuous. It's also a rounded binary. You get the digression phrase, ends with the half cadence, right there. And then you get both A1 and A2 back. Now it stands to reason though, that when I repeat A1 and A2, I can't do the exact same thing, right? Because I have to end with a PAC in the main key. So it stands to reason that A2 will have some alterations so we can get the PAC at the very ending. All right, so again, this is an example of a continuous rounded binary. The one interesting feature of this, I think, was that the first part ended with a half cadence in the main key. I actually haven't seen too many examples that do that, so it's kind of an interesting example. All right, let's go on to the next one. Now, I'm sure you're going to be familiar with this piece. This used to be attributed to J.S. Bach, but now they're not so sure who actually composed it. Anyhow, let me go ahead and play this for you. So part one. Part two, I may have to play this a little slower. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and try this one out on your own. Okay, now that you've had a little time to look at this one, In this case, the larger phrases are 8 measures each. You might hear them broken up into 4 measure subphrases, but basically all the phrases are 8 measures. Now, this is a sectional simple binary. It's sectional because the first part ends with the PAC in the main key. Other than that, it's a textbook period, A1, A2. Actually, if you looked at the details of this phrase, you'd see it's one of those hybrids of a sentence and a period. But the larger 2 phrases are antecedent consequent. Anyhow, this isn't sectional because it ends with the PAC in the main key. Then it's also a simple binary. So it has the digression again, ends at measure 24. Now, there was actually a very interesting thing that happened at measure 24. It's kind of difficult to represent on a diagram, but instead of that being a half cadence with the 5 chord, it was actually a PAC in the key of 5. But if you have a PAC in the key of 5, you can also easily change it back, its function back to 5/7. That last note of the measure, you'll see he gave you the C natural to bring you back. So it's a little bit of a mixture between a PAC, which is what it sounds like, and also a half cadence in that it leads back. So it kind of becomes 5. So a very interesting cadence there. But then this is a simple binary because, as you can see, after that, you don't return to A material. You get some new material, or, I mean, it's still developing the motives of A, but it's definitely not a return to, right? So that would be called C, and therefore this is a sectional simple binary. So quite different than the last one. Last one was continuous rounded binary. This one's sectional simple binary. And like I mentioned, Baroque era pieces, more likely you would find more examples of simple binary from the Baroque era. All right, now let's go on to our last example. Here's a very familiar piece to you. Again, we'll just look at the main theme, because if you want some more practice, though, you could take a look at the first variation of this. But let's just take a look at the main theme, and same deal. I want you to do a diagram it, but I'll need to play this a little bit slower. All right, part 1. Sorry. All right, that's part 1. Now part 2. Sorry. Sorry. Sorry, let me try that last phrase again. Go ahead and pause your video. All right, here's my answer to this example. This is yet another continuous rounded binary. After all, it is a classical era, so we're more likely to get a rounded binary. To me, in some ways, this is the textbook example for most of the classical era rounded binaries. So it's continuous because this one has the modulation to the key of the dominant. It's still an antecedent consequent, but the PAC is in the key of 5 or A major. Then standard digression that ends with a half cadence. Then we get the recap in the tonic key. And you'll notice that I have this as just one phrase, because it was just one phrase, and it's a combination of the A1 and the A2 phrases. If you look at it, it's actually the first 2 measures of A1, and then it's the last two measures of A2, but transposed so we don't end up in the key of the dominant. So here's an example of a continuous rounded binary. But these three examples alone show you there's a lot of variety you can do. Even though there's some commonalities, there's also quite a bit of variety you can get from the binary form. So if you'd like some more practice, you can also take a look at those two additional ones that we didn't talk about, the trio of the Haydn example and the first variation of the Mozart example.